What is it that I'm feeling? So let's say that I hear that my brother has a drug problem and my experience is fear. The next Adlerian question would be, and just for you, first of all, I want to hear about the fear and explore the fear, but somewhere along the line, I want to be able to say to him, and what is the exact opposite of fear?
Welcome to Now What Podcast. Today we have James Robert Bitter, and he's a counselor, educator who's taught for more than 50 years. He is going to be talking about not just Adlerian psychology, but about Gestalt theory and family therapy. He also works with narrative therapy, which I don't know much about, and hopefully today we will learn a little bit more. I am your host. I'm Yogi Patel. My goal is to support and encourage folks in workplace, in homes, and in childcare settings. So thank you, James, for joining us. Is it okay for me to call you James?
Absolutely. It's been very nice to be here, Yogi.
It's been a pleasure. I've heard so much about you through different Adlerian psychology conferences that I attend. It's speaks to the Adlerian psychology where anytime I call on a professor or anyone who's been practicing Adlerian psychology, they're very warm, they're very open and eager to share and support those who might be interested. So I appreciate you being here. And today I wanted to talk a lot about exogenous factors. And I want you to speak to what that might be in terms of the theory and how that might affect one in their home, their families, and the whole situation. So, for example, when someone is unwell, we find out the news that someone might be unwell. How does that affect everyone? And what does Adler say about the exogenous factor? And how can we be encouraging regardless of all that's going on around us?
We live in a world today in which, if you're paying attention to the news, nothing but exogenous factors are happening minute by minute. The world is changing at rapid rates, and those things affect families and local communities all around the world, really. We start with Adler's notion that it is not what happens in life, but how it gets interpreted. So the same event can lead two different people to come to radically different conclusions about what's going on. I remember years ago, I went to see a daredevil named Evel Knievel. He was going to do his best to jump a motorcycle over a canyon that contained the Snake River in Idaho. And I forget how wide the distance was, but it was a good deal. Now, I remember looking over the edge of the canyon and practically getting vertigo. I mean, it just took my breath away and scared the heck out of me just looking down. It was like 1,500 feet straight down. Yet this man was getting ready to get on a motorcycle, run up a ramp, try to jump over the rest of the canyon, land on another ramp on the other side, and come down. Not only was this kind of an exciting / terrifying event, but it turns out he actually didn't make it. And so in the end, what you see is his motorcycle dropping 1,500 feet, and he's floating down on a parachute, which was his backup going into it. Two different people experiencing the same event, but with radically different interpretations. Now, if we ask ourselves, well, how was he able to do that? Why wasn't he scared? And the answer is because he was totally prepared and he had everything under control. Anxiety only works if you feel like you are out of control. So he had everything down to that, including everything that could go wrong, and he was prepared for it. So it wasn't frightening him. It was just excitement and performance. Okay, let's say that I am in a family and I learned that my grandmother has a serious illness and is about to die. Certainly, my parents are going to have one kind of reaction to that. After all, one of them is her child. But they may not have the same reaction because literally one of them, the other one is not her child. And not only that, but I'm a grandchild. And how old am I? Well, if I'm 18, 19 years of age and I've had her in my life for many years, that's one level of experience. But if I am 4 or 5, maybe a different level of experience. And if I'm 2, maybe no experience of any login at all. Okay. So whenever somebody is, an exogenous factor is just something external that is happening and that people experience. My brother becomes addicted to opioids. It's not happening directly to me, but I'm experiencing it. So the question is, what is it that means to me? And I may have any sort of intellectual responses to it, but the ones that seem to matter are my emotional responses. So I would be wanting to ask somebody, anybody who is experiencing something from the outside, and that includes, by the way, wonderful things too. My daughter getting married, for instance. What is it that I'm feeling? So let's say that I hear that my brother has a drug problem and my experience is fear. The next Adlerian question would be, and just for you, first of all, I want to hear about the fear and explore the fear, but somewhere along the line, I want to be able to say to him, and what is the exact opposite of fear for you? Now, you might expect the word safety, or you might expect the word calm or peaceful. What happens if what the person says is competence? What happens if what the person says is, I would feel exuberant? So then I would have to know what the meaning of those words are. But I then have 2 points on a line. I have the fear point, whatever that's defined as. And let's say the person said competence. Okay, I have that and what that feels like and where that is. Now what we've created is a sense of what Adler called movement, the law of movement. A person trying to move from a felt minus position, fear, to a felt plus position, competence. Okay. Now, how does one get there? How does the person move? What are the steps in their life from fear to competence? What do they do? Another way of saying that is when something like fear comes up, how do they cope? You were talking about children earlier. Let's just try that with kids. I'm a parent. I come to my mom or dad and I tell them, I'm afraid to go to school. Now, if you were my parents in my day, and by my day, I'm talking ancient history, back in the 1950s, if I had said that, my mother's response would have been a warm, empathic, it doesn't matter, you're going anyway. A little later on, parents might have gone so far as to say, well, what are you worried about? And followed by, well, don't worry about that. Just go to school. My interest would be, okay, you're scared to go to school. What scares you about that? And I'd even be interested in knowing, where do you feel it in your body? What is it that is you're experiencing? Do you have any thoughts that go with that? You have to understand that somebody who's 6, 7 years old probably can do that. Someone in preschool, 4 or 5, maybe not so much. But they can tell me, if you weren't feeling afraid and you were feeling the best you could feel, what would that be like? Now, again, I have their movement. And I can say to even a child, so what would be the difference? What would have to happen in order for you to not be afraid of this and feel like this? The reason that I think this is empowering is because even though they may not be very good at it at a young age, we're asking them to solve their own life problems. We are not saying, here's what you do, here's how you handle it, here's where you get there. We're saying, here's a structure of thinking. If you're old enough to go to school, you're old enough to think. And you can start to think about how you handle it. Now, we do know from Piaget that the thinking is going to be really concrete up until about, age of 12 or 13 years of age. But so what? Concrete thinking is just as good as any other if you are thinking about steps to get from here to there. I'm always interested in movement, and movement implies direction. So somewhere in that discussion, the child, by defining where they want to get to, is going to tell you something about what their goal is. Now, in young children, the goals are generally fairly immediate. Now, Dreikers was really good at talking about the goals of misbehavior, but the goals of getting out of exogenous factors, those could be any one of a million different things. So we got to become kind of attuned to what the kid is telling us about where they want to get to, what they want to have happen. Maybe the child will say, well, I could do it if I had lots of friends. I don't have any friends at school. Well, that is a problem. We may have to talk about, well, how do you get friends? Hell, I know adults who don't know how to get friends. I know people who used to know how to have friends who went through some traumatic experience and lost their ability to do it. The interesting part to me is always that the rules for friendship are pretty much just universal and the same. The first rule is you have to get out into the world and engage people. No one has ever knocked on my door and said, hi, my name is Charlie and I'd like to be your friend. If you want to, you have to go places where other people are. And then you have to act in ways that engage people. So learning the simple things like how to say hello, how to smile, how to shake hands if that's the custom, how to be interested in other people without being a busybody or nosy, how to let other people be interested in you, how to tell them about you without going on for 6 hours. We, as adults, think at least we know something about how to do that. We may have to break it down with starting steps in the movement from I don't have any friends to I would like to have more.
Lovely. I appreciated all of the examples. One of the things you mentioned earlier was that anxiety factor. And I want us to think about students, children, parents, and social media. One of the biggest challenge that we have is age appropriateness and learning. So when our child is all of a sudden looking for extreme social media and we try to get into this power struggle, what do you notice in terms of examples or in Adlerian psychology, how we would support the students in understanding what is appropriate for them, what they can and cannot do while still maintaining relationship and being the adult?
Depending on how old the adult is, this can be a real challenge. I had children very late in life. I was 45 years old when my oldest daughter was born, and I was 51 when my second child, Nora, was born. Even back then, that was, 30-some years ago, the phone was a challenge, but it was nothing compared to what it is today. So I do think that parents have to decide, and that takes courage to tell your child, you're not going to get to do everything that every other kid in school is doing. You may have a phone, but you're not going to have access to all these other things. Given that, you can only control so much. If your child, in fact, does have friends, they'll be able to get to anything on an internet that is out there. So the much more important thing is to, from my perspective, is to have age-based discussions about what they might run into on the internet and how to handle it when it comes. There's two problems with that. One is that some of us adults have to figure out ourselves what the hell's on the internet. We don't know. And even my kids who don't have children, but if they were parents at this point, they would know a lot about what was going on and what was out there, but they might not know how to help a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid manage it. At that point, it seems to me that discussions about really concrete things, if you have a friend who wants you to look at this or wants you to do that, you will not ever be in trouble, but I want you to let me know. And if something happens on the internet and you in your heart know that it's not right for you, I want us to practice you saying, I don't want to look at that. Because basically what you're doing is preparing your child to make decisions about what's good and bad for them as they go. Now, keep in mind they're going to make mistakes. And not only that, but we as parents are going to make mistakes. My friend Rachel Schifron says to be a parent is to make a mistake every day. And, in the end, we are going to learn by experience. If you go way back to my childhood, my mother, in an effort to teach me that a stove could be hot, would wait until I reached for the stove, and then she'd slap my hand away and say, no. My aunt, who had a degree in child psychology, would wait for her son, my cousin, to reach for the stove, and she would say, no, hot. You see what a difference education can make. I contend that never taught either of us that the stove was hot. It taught us don't go near our mothers because they're dangerous. But it doesn't teach us anything about a hot stove. So how do you learn that? One way to learn it is you could take your child when they're big enough to get on a chair and get up to the stove and turn the stove on. Gas burners are wonderful for this because kids get fire. And you could have them put their hand out and feel the heat without burning themselves and say, look, if you've ever touched this when it's hot, they make ceramic top stoves that are designed to kill even adults. So in the end, most of us still learn about a hot stove the same way I did when I was a kid. We burn ourselves, hopefully not too badly. And that is true in every other part of life. Experience is still the best teacher, both negative and positive. It's amazing what we can survive. I want us as adults to help children figure things out they need to know before they get there, but that's not always going to happen. So when a bad experience happens, rather than reacting from our fear, like this, something awful could have happened to my kid, reacting from our compassion, reacting from our sense of interest. Now, what happened? How did this go down? What would you like to have had happen differently? What can I do to help you so this will... See, inquiry always beats telling some kid what the right answer is. Maybe when they're 3, 4 years old, not much of it sinks in, but you start the pattern. And by the time they're 6, 7, 8 years old, they become problem solvers in their own life.
You mentioned having a conversation, and one of the things that I love speaking about from my early childhood is always getting in trouble. So you find that you're going to get in trouble if you quarrel with your sibling, or if you push them around, or get a bad grade in school. So one of the things that we start to do, and I know I did that, was fib or omit information. And Dr. Alfred Adler speaks about lying. It's when children, or when we lie, the truth is probably unbearable. So can you speak to a little bit about Adlerian theory on why would children lie or adults lie, and how is it that we could go past the lying part and really just encourage?
To put it in the simplest terms I can get to, I can only think of 2 general reasons for lying. And that's true for both children and adults. The first is to avoid punishment or to avoid a bad outcome, to avoid some anticipated negative turn of events. I come in from a day's work, having parked the car in the driveway, and I say to my 3 kids, one of whom is 4 years old, who left the tricycle in the driveway? Now, first of all, I already know the answer to that. The 14-year-old isn't riding the tricycle. It's the 4-year-old. So why ask a question that is designed to get a lie? If I'm a 4-year-old, I'm going to claim I've never had a bike because I know I'm about to get in trouble just from the tone of voice of the question. If I come into a room and say, did you hit your sister? I mean, do we think our kids are some mythical George Washington who's going to stand up and say, yep, I cannot tell a lie. It was me. I clobbered her. It's not going to happen. So if you're a parent, the simplest way to avoid lying, to avoid punishment in children is don't ask them anything that would lead to a lie. You just go the other direction. Okay, there's a tricycle in the driveway and it needs to be moved. Or better yet, there's a tricycle in the driveway. There used to be a tricycle in the driveway and I ran over it. Or there's a tricycle in the driveway and I have put it up and whoever left it there can get it back in a week. Whatever kind of consequence you're going to give anyway, you can do without begging for a lie going down the road. The other form of lying, or the other purpose to lying, is often to elevate ourselves, to tell a story that's just makes us look better, makes us feel stronger, whatever. And these are interesting lies because they're often based on fantasy or they're based on some creative part in the child that is trying to make up a better life than they're having at the moment. I don't know if any teachers still do this, but back when I was a kid, one of the first things you had to do when you came back in the fall to school was write an essay on what you did that summer.
Oh, yes.
So I remember this one essay that this teacher gave me that this kid wrote. I think it was like in the 2nd or 3rd grade. And it was about he and his family had traveled that summer to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And they had gotten to go in and see where all the gold in the United States was. See, it's not just Donald Trump that wants to go see the gold. Kids in my day wanted to go see it too. So anyway, the essay talked about what the gold bars weighed, how they looked, what the size was, all of that. And that he had been chosen among all the kids that went in the family on this trip to bring one of the gold bars home for the summer. And he had that gold bar for a whole summer, but unfortunately he couldn't show it at school because he had to take it back last week. Now, in point of fact, this is a very poor kid who never left town and literally didn't do anything special that summer, but probably was just sick and tired of being the only kid who didn't do anything special. So he outdid everybody. Was it a lie? Yes, but it's a lie that makes him feel bigger, better, more important. There's no difference between that and my grandfather, the fish he caught keep getting bigger every year that he told the story. There's no difference. The two things I think that Adler would say to parents is, first of all, don't set kids up to lie. And secondly, ignore the lie and try to figure out what the goal is behind it, what the purpose is of telling it. And is there something that we could do that would help the kid cope without needing the lie?
You spoke about when children, especially this young man who wanted to have this amazing life and adventure, significance and belonging. Alfred Adler speaks about that quite a bit. The behaviors that sort of follow, Dreiker speak about. Can you speak to that when it comes to the family dynamics?
Rather than belonging, I think about the idea of having a sense of self, a sense of who I am, personhood. That's part of belonging. It's part of the feeling of belonging. I often disagree with Dreiker's notion of a need to belong. I don't think we have a need to belong, but I do think we want to feel that we belong. And I think that feeling is a sense that we know who we are and the place that we are in. And when we're little, that place for most of us is in a family. And Our family is made up of a certain number of people. And beyond our family, there's extended family. And beyond even our extended family, there's neighbors and friends and a community. And that community often has a culture. And the culture often is part of a larger weaving of cultures in a society. And our societies are part of nations. Years ago, I read a book by Joel Giraud in which he took Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and he broke them up the way Europe would be broken up, by culture, by language, by all of that. And he essentially thought there were 9 nations in North America. I was born and raised in the state of Washington, and I've lived for over 30 years now in the South. I've been here for 30 years, and I still don't feel like this is home. The minute I get back in the state of Washington, I feel, even if I'm going to visit just for 2 days, I feel at home. I was raised in the Catholic Church. I've been to many other churches in life, but even though there's a whole bunch of stuff about Catholicism with which I disagree, and I don't go to church very much, when I am going to church, going to a Catholic church is where I feel at home. It's like immediately I have this sense. So all these things interlaced with our life experiences and come to kind of shape who we are. Adler spent a great deal of time talking about birth order and how important that was. All birth order is a vantage point. If you're an oldest child, you have the vantage point of oldest children to look at life. You can look at it in a lot of different ways. The one thing you can't do is look at it as if you're a youngest child. You'll never have that experience any more than the youngest will have the experience of being oldest. Middle children are kind of amorphous, and so some of them might have similar viewpoints, but even they differentiate. Only children, their vantage point is, the world was designed for me. Now, what did they make of that? Well, maybe they extended themselves beyond their family into their neighborhood, into their friendships, and learned that the world wasn't only about them. But all of us, whatever we do, are trying to continually grow the sense of self and have meaning and purpose in our life. And we start that when we're very little. Adler thought around 5 or 6. In fact, he thought the way you approach life was formed by then. I disagree with that. I think it starts to form then, but I think we know a lot more about adolescent development than we did in Adler's day. We know, for instance, that the male brain is still growing 26, 27 years of age. And by the way, one of the last aspects of male psychological development to come into play is the capacity for commitment. So if you're marrying an 18-year-old kid, you're probably playing Russian roulette with your marriage prospects. When a child starts to figure out who they are, they're getting a lot of input from a lot of different sources, from schools, from parents, from community, from friendships, all of those different things. In order to be functional, the child will start to choose patterns that they can rely on. If the child's pattern is, I'm really happy, I like people, I go out and greet them, I am engaged with them, kind of the early stuff of social interest, they're going to be happier kids. If they are in a pattern where I must be the boss, I must have my own way, I must get what I want when I want it, they're going to be unhappier kids, and they're going to cause more problems for the people around them. So part of it is saying, okay, here's where the kid is now. Let's say it's a kid who bullies other kids. What do we know about that kid? Well, first of all, we know that his biggest fear is that he won't get things the way he wants them, and he pushes people around, bullies them to get there. So again, we have this movement. Adler said, when you see somebody acting in a very strong, negative, outgoing way, you can be certain that they have an equally strong inferiority complex. So if we can come to understand what that child's felt minus position is and help them find useful ways to get beyond that, great. I had a very smart 3rd grade teacher who, a nun, by the way, every week we had a spelling bee. And every week, this young kid refused to do the spelling test. And he especially refused to do the spelling bee when he had to talk out loud. One day, she said to him, John, this is your day to read the spelling words. So John had to get up, just like the teacher did, and say, spell the word solid. And the kids would write it down. And then after it was all done, he'd have to go through it, and he'd have to say the words, spell the word, and then, have kids mark it off. She moved him from recipient of pain into leader of process. Not only that, but the kids did to him what they did to her, which is raise their hand or shout out, I didn't get that. Do it again, slower. So he probably spelled some of the words 2 or 3 times. By the time he was done with that particular process, by the way, he knew how to spell all of the words.
How encouraging.
Yeah. So if we can, as adults, learn to kind of think about where kids are and what would gain them their significance, what would help them feel in a positive way. What are the steps to get there? We can't get everything to turn out perfectly. That never happens. But we can experiment with process so that positive outcomes are possible.
I would love to expand on this a little bit further. When I offer classroom educators trainings, one of the biggest questions is bullying, or the topic is parents are really upset because we have a bully and we need this bully to leave the school. What are some of the things that might be happening and this is, early ages, 3 to 6-year-olds and primary schools, which we call elementary here in the US, or middle school, where one child is perhaps hurting others by pushing them or talking out of turns. You mentioned this smart teacher at 3rd grader who included the student. How would teachers, while taking care of all of these students in their classroom, manage the behavior of this one student? What are a few things that you think would be helpful?
Let's take the word bully out of it. That's just an evaluation, a description.
Okay.
Let's say we have a child who hits other kids. Would that kind of what we're talking about?
Yes, hitting or just name calling.
Okay. When I look at hitting, what does that mean? It means that the child is misusing their hands. I could spend a whole bunch of time saying, which is what adults generally do, don't hit, which especially if you're talking to a kid who's in a power struggle, the only thing that tells them is keep hitting. So another thing I could do is I could say, what does that kid need to learn about touch that is acceptable, helpful, useful? You also have to keep in mind that very often the kids who are bullies have been hurt themselves. So they probably have had negative training about how hands are used. If I could help that kid learn to do positive touch, I'm going to have a chance of transforming. So what would that be? Well, the first thing is I want to start doing touch in it that is non-human. It can be as simple as I would like the kid to learn to work with clay or some other activity, squeezing balls, a sport like basketball where the hands are used to dribble and to pass. I want to do some of that. Next, I want to engage him, if I can, with animals. 2 types of animals are especially good. Dogs, because they do unconditional love, and horses. So if there was a place if I had a kid who did that and there was a place in the area that did equine therapy, absolutely. I would like to get a lot of kids in groups who have had trouble with knowing what to do with their hands, engaged in equine therapy. Then I would like the child to get a lot of positive touch. Now, there are limits on what you can do in schools because of all this fear that people have around adults doing touch. But there are some things that are still acceptable. You can still shake hands. I would like to greet this kid at the door. Every day he comes, every day he leaves. If he has recess in between, in and out, we're going to shake hands. I'm going to do it with every kid. But when it comes to him, when I shake his hand, my other hand is going to go over his so he feels and he has my complete attention in that experience. I want to start to build a lot of positive touch into the kid's life. Now, you mentioned something else. I can't remember what it was at the moment.
Name calling.
Oh, name calling. I'm not against name calling. I'm against stupid name calling. Rather than calling somebody a piece of, I'd like to teach you how to refer to them as a scatological heap. There are words that don't have to offend because nobody knows what the heck you're saying. If you're one of those kids who gets off on name calling, it puts you in an elevated level. But you're really sending the message of saying there are better ways to talk than this. The thing about name calling is that in order for it to work, it has to hurt somebody's feelings. So I wouldn't mind having a discussion with a whole group of kids about what the purpose of name calling is, which is to make one person feel bigger and another person feel small. You can't feel small by something someone says unless you let it happen. So I might spend some time, I don't want to get into blaming the victim type of stuff, but I want to spend some time in letting you learn how to let things go, brush things off your back, be a duck, get rid of the water on your wings, shake it off. There are first graders who can be taught every animal except humans. When they want to get rid of stress or anxiety, they shake. My dog, when she gets up from a nap, shakes. I think shaking's a wonderful thing. If every time some kid called somebody in this classroom a name, everybody would just shake, it would become funny. And then it would lose its power. The question is, for me, always, do I understand what the problem is? Do I understand who the people are? Is there something that we can all do together in a group or sometimes individually that can transform this into something else?
So you talked about the community, creating community, understanding behaviors, and now caregivers, parents.
Yeah.
You work with family and therapy. What are some of the ways with this challenging, rushing around every day, work, home, children, we're very stressed in current days. What are some of the things that could bring us back to being a family and enjoying the time? You spoke about 50 years ago. I know in my family, we always had rituals like before we eat, we take some food out and we offer it to the animals or someone who needed more meal for their dinner. And then we ate fruits as a dessert. But one of the things I'm noticing all around me, my friends, and there's so many challenges that are coming because they're taking care of their aging family members. They are taking care of their own children. And then the world around us with the media, there's so much given to us, sort of like balancing act.
Well, first of all, I don't think that many of us are good at balance, and I'm certainly not, nor is my spouse. You know, I know that it gets tiresome to listen when I was a kid stuff, but life really is tremendously different and more difficult today than it was just 30 years ago. So I'm a member of the baby boom generation. It's a crazy period in history. It's an anomaly. Up until World War II, there was no such thing as a single parent workers. We were still mostly an agrarian society. Not only that, but we were in the middle of a depression for over a decade before World War II. And you did whatever you could to survive. My grandparents and my parents talk about a quart of ice cream that sold for a nickel because the depression was on. And the problem was, of course, people didn't have a nickel. I know people who used to work for, old people who are passed on now, but I knew people in my life who had at one time worked for a penny a day and were happy to get it. Now, World War II happens, and that's one of the things that gets us out of a depression. And all of a sudden, all these men come back from World War II. The women have been working while the men have been gone. My mother was a telephone operator. Other people were nurses. People worked in factories. Women ran everything. And believe me, business understood what was coming. So they essentially ran the biggest propaganda process in the history of the country, convincing women to go home and have a good life, raise some kids. You get things coming out after World War II. Before World War II, if you wanted to clean your floor, you got down on the floor with, steel wool and stuff, and you scrubbed the floor. After World War II, you had mop and glow. You sprayed it, you had a mop, you did that stuff. We made things to make women's life at home easier and to have them be there to raise the kids. And even though probably my father, at the height of his retail paint and glass business, was probably making $11,000, $12,000 a year. But in 1960, that was middle income. He was doing well. We had a good life. Went on a vacation once a week. What did our parents do? Were they child-centered people? Hell no. My mother said to me, go outside and play. And she meant at 8 o'clock in the morning, and don't come back until 6 o'clock at night. But when I went outside, there were 30 kids on my block. It was the baby boom generation. And if I didn't like those 30 kids, I could go 2 blocks over and there'd be another 30 kids. So there were kids everywhere. You learned to make your own play. By the time I was an adult, to live in the same house that my parents raised me in, we needed 2 incomes. By the time we had children, and I had them late. I was in my 40s. My wife was in her 30s. When we had our children, there weren't 30 kids on the block. In fact, there were a bunch of older people on the block. And so what did we do? We scheduled them in a ton of different activities. I mean, we started Suzuki violin at 5. Hell, we started kinder music before that. Then violin lessons and dance and God knows what else. Even some sports, like my kids did softball and they did all that stuff. And what did we do as parents? We became car people. We drove them around to these things and dropped them off and picked them up. We scheduled their lives, which took away from them the challenge of creating their own fun. If I came in to my parents and said, I don't have anything to do, they said, we'll give you something to do, and they put you to work. If our kids came and said that, we said, well, what do you want to do? And we tried to figure out some other program they could get into to do that. Problem with all of that is that it seeped into parent control of children's lives, and it took away from the kids agency in their own play and their own fantasy life and their own work, all of that stuff. So the very first thing that I would suggest for families is that rather than give into this, I'm planning everything for my kids, get used to engaging kids in the planning process themselves. Now, how do you do that? One of the oldest things that Dreikers invented was a thing called the family council, in which at least once a week. And my friend, by the way, Virginia Satir, suggested once a day. But nonetheless, once a week, sit down with your kids and engage them in the planning of what you want to do. Like, rather than I'm setting up everything for Christmas, what do we want to do this Christmas? Now, I'll guarantee you, if you ask my kids, even 30 years ago, what do you want to do for Christmas? They would say, go to Disneyland. And I would have to say, well, that would be nice, but we can't afford that. What do you want to do around the house? How do you want Christmas to look? Do you want a Christmas tree? Do you want something else? Do you want to decorate or not? What kind of decorations do you want to have? And engaging them in those processes. Now, you said in your family, you would go out and give food to pets or you'd give them to other people, and then you'd come back and you'd have meals. Engaging children as young as 4 or 5 in the creation of meals. This sense of we do things together gets lost because parents are so busy. They think it's easier for them to just do it themselves. But it would be better to have a really late dinner that everybody participated in than it would be to have a perfect dinner on time. We're going to have Saturday off. What do we want to do with Saturday? I like to get children engaged as early as possible in participating in the process of doing things, not just doing things and having things done. I like them to solve their own problems. My youngest daughter, Nora, when she was about, I don't know, she wasn't very old, 3 years old maybe. She came crying to me and she said, Allie, as her older sister, hit her. And I seriously doubt it was much of a hit, but okay. I said to Nora, what would you like to have happen? And she said, you should punish her. I said, and do you have a punishment in mind? Yes, she said. I think you should hit her. I said, okay. I said, can I ask you a question? She said, okay. How long has your sister been mean to you? Since I was born. Really? That's a long time. You're 3 years old now. Yes. Okay. So you've known for a long time, right, that your sister is what? Dangerous? Yes. Okay. Now, how close do you have to get to a dangerous person in order for them to hit you? She said, what do you mean? I said, like, if Allie's in that room and you're in this room, can she hit you? No. Well, how close? Well, I have to be right next to her. Okay. I said, well, the next time you come and tell me that your sister hit you, I'll know that you forgot about her danger zone and got too close to her. So best of luck. Stay out of her danger zone. Now, all I'm doing, you can look at that and say, well, that's kind of snarky or not very empathic or whatever. And yeah, that's all true. But I'm also saying to you, don't be coming to me to solve your problems. I'll help you to talk it through. But you got a sister. You're going to be sisters the rest of your natural life. Get used to it. Oh, not my fault that you were born 6 years later than her. Just life happens. I would like modern parents to do less problem solving themselves and let kids do more.
That's a wonderful way to end our podcast today. Encouraging families to spend time together and collaborate and share in the joy of chores and planning and more. Jim Bitter, thank you for being here and sharing many, many Adlerian and other tools with so much humor. I enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thanks so much for having me.